years, we have been blessed and fortunate to be bringing the cream of Nordic startups from pretty much every single genre, sector, and vertical to the UK. And I think you've just heard two rather well put together, well crafted, very succinct, well designed talks. Here's where we go off the cliff. I'm a terrible designer, and also today part of my talk is going to be propaganda, why you should come to the UK. It's going to be how you should come to the UK, and how to actually do it yourself, potentially. And there's a serious risk that we end up not going into sufficient details on any. But I mean, fingers crossed something worthwhile can emerge from this. I use this to illustrate this because this is an NFT company from Sweden that we look after, which has repurposed its mission temporarily to fundraise for Ukraine. And we will talk about the value of the UK news agenda in fulfilling these various things shortly. Now, I really don't want my talk today to be an extended advert for my company, though I obviously look forward to working for you all over the next 2 or 3 years. But I do think the story of how I, possibly the least Nordic person on the planet, come to be looking after all these Nordic companies is inextricably linked to understanding the opportunities that Britain offers. So to jump back, to jump forward, I used to work in this building. I used to work at the Daily Telegraph when it was based here, one of the most traditional British newspapers. The thing that I encountered when working at the Daily Telegraph was, number one, a collapsing newspaper circulation and a complete inability on the part of newspapers to work out how to make news pay. Nothing changes. But I also encountered how unbelievably stupid PR people were. I was working on the politics desk and I get calls, and this kind of dates it, from people asking me to review an Anna Kournikova sports watch. And I thought to myself, well, how hard can this be? So with all the arrogance of youth, I started a company 15 years ago, and my logic was focus on arts and culture. It's what I find interesting. But make it all about news. PR people are scared of news, but actually it should be about setting the news, responding to the news. So within 2 years, we were looking after Top Left, a band that millennials have never heard of, Top Right, the biggest dance festival in Europe, Bottom Right, not Kevin Spacey, though there is not a man in London under the age of 45 who does not have a Kevin Spacey story, myself included, but a very famous portrait artist, and various publishers. And the sorts of things that we used to do for these artistic concepts was we would take a cultural idea and drop a piece of technology on top of it in order to make news. So a perfect example of this, main train station in London, King's Cross. There was an arts venue with lots of pretentious poetry and photography and all sorts of things nearby. They knew they needed to connect with commuters. There was this exciting new technology called Twitter, which had just emerged. 140 characters, the length of a haiku. 3 years of Cambridge English was useful after all. And so I thought to myself, well, let's use Twitter as a means by which commuters can engage with this artistic concept. So we persuaded the owner of the sign, the advertising agency who owned it, Sky News, which used it, and the train station to allow commuters to tweet a haiku about the weather, because like the Norwegians, the British are obsessed with the weather, which would then appear in near real time. We then thought Japanese poetry, who is the only Japanese person most British people know, it's the lady who destroyed the Beatles. We persuaded her to judge the whole thing. Now this was the sort of thing that we were doing. All good fun, but you work for artists, musicians, they're rampant egomaniacs, they never pay their bills on time and think you should be paying them. But my life changed, and this will get to the point, I swear, my life changed when in 2012 I discovered Sweden. This was a project which was, though I didn't realize it at the time, a very Swedish idea, a very Nordic idea, and as I meet more people from the Baltics, I realize a similarly innovative Baltic idea, which was an attempt to document a single day in human history through digital photography. The idea was the whole world will get together over 24 hours and document itself. Very Swedish idea, very clever. The problem was, the American media didn't find this remotely interesting. The European media didn't find this remotely interesting. The Asian media didn't care either. And you see, with projects like this, they're launched often and regularly, and they also often and regularly fail. Because the problem is you can't get people to participate, ergo there is no newsworthy outcome, therefore the whole thing folds. But What was different about this was that the British media went huge on this. They loved it. And the reason they loved it as an idea was not the fact that Instagram was crossing into the mainstream at this point. It wasn't the fact that it was a good idea. It was the fact that it was Swedish.
Okay, right.
There we go. When you set off Siri, it's, you're doing something well. But anyway, so if you imagine, about 10 years ago, 11 years ago, during the last recession, the British middle classes and the British media became completely and utterly obsessed with all things Scandinavian, Nordic, and it has to be said, initially Swedish. We've always been in love with the Swedes. You also speak better English than we do. Same goes for Norwegians and the Danes, I might add. But the reality is, it reached a point whereby the British middle class obsession, and I mean, I hasten to add, this is from a satirical British newspaper, a company with vague socialist ideas and a fondness for gloomy crime dramas, think they're actually becoming Swedish. This obsession, I noticed, crossed over from the cultural media into the business media. Sweden, Swedish. It's in the headline. It's emblematic of some kind of virtue, some virtue we project. And the thing is, this coincided when I was in Stockholm working on this project with a moment where there was, for want of a better expression, generation 2 of startups emerging from Sweden after Spotify. You could throw a rock on Kungsgatan and you hit someone on the back of the head who had some world-changing startup concept. And the thing is, I was watching a lot of the Swedes, and I say this with love and respect to all the Swedes in the room, but the Swedes are often the most brilliant when it comes to design, when it comes to innovation. You know this, though you're too modest to ever say it. But the fact is, you're absolutely appalling at marketing yourselves internationally. You also rarely survive first contact with an American. An American will say to you, I am the best in the world at my job. And a British person goes, well, that's why we love Americans, that self-confidence. A Swede goes, what an incredible stroke of luck that I have met the person who is the best in the world in their job. What a coincidence. So I thought to myself, well, hold on, rather than going straight to America, where, let's be honest, the Americans cannot differentiate between Sweden, Switzerland, Swaziland, instead, use the UK media with its pre-programmed affection, nay, obsession for all things Scandinavian. Use it as an entry point to the English-speaking world. Because if you look at a lot of the biggest media brands on the planet, BBC, 7th most visited news site on the planet every single day. The Guardian, which is 2nd most visited news site on the planet every day. Mail Online, God help us, the most visited news site in the world every single day. Use the UK as an entry point to the wider English-speaking world. I also realised that actually, as I said, terrible design, actually the reality is what news-based PR can offer for startups, irrespective of their type, their focus, is number one, engagement with the investment community. It is all, let's face it, most people in this room care about it, keeps you awake at night, it's the thing that you need to do. There is a huge distinction between, hello, you've never heard of us, would you like a meeting? And hello, we were in Bloomberg last week, would you like a meeting? Number two, recruitment. Number three, explaining what a business does, its innovation, the problem that it solves. And I think this is a key point to put across. A lot of startups, fintech, sustainability, whatever it might be, you forget that actually the first story about you is very often the problem and the quantification of the problem that you solve. Because actually that can often be the first news story. Strategic and commercial partners, leverage for sales teams, we've talked about this, conference presence and visibility. Conference organizers want people on stage who have a media presence. And user acquisition and sales, to an extent, PR plays a role in that. And the entire model and logic has been establish yourself in the UK because it is easier to go from the Financial Times to the Wall Street Journal than it is, with respect to you all, some Lord of the Rings language newspaper in the north of Europe, to the Wall Street Journal. And this is the key. So, fast forward several years, this is a sliver of the companies we have found ourselves working for. But we have been blessed to look after a number of interesting companies within the business, corporate, and indeed fintech space. Just to zip through, this is now assuming that I have converted you to why you should come to the UK. UK and use our Nordic and indeed Baltic obsessed media as your gateway to the wider English-speaking world. This is just some examples of the sort of things which, to be honest, you need to think about before you come over here. Whether you come here, whether you go straight to the US, wherever you might go. And you need to think about the different types of media exposure that fintech companies can have and prepare in advance. So number one, it's all about the profile of the company and indeed senior team within business media. I mean, at the top we have one of my favorite fintech clients, at the bottom, non-fintech clients in the shape of Fishbrain, Eggshaw, Babel from Berlin. But this is a very good example of I suppose you could call it a corporate technology company called Mentimeter, which maybe some of you have heard of. Very Swedish, allows you to vote on how meetings are going. What a relief you're not using it today. But if you look at the very first story that ever appeared in the English-speaking world, on the far left, Swedish, it is in the headline. In exactly the same way that Lithuanian, Norwegian, Danish will also be in the headline. That article in London Evening Standard also quantified the problem, which was the fact that most meetings suck, basically. And here was the solution. Top right is an article which looks at what this company did in terms of its culture. So again, another interesting route to business media. You need to work out what is the problem you solve, what's interesting about your company culture. Bottom right, these two articles, because with media exposure, you are scaling up every single time. One article sets up the next. So we were able to take these two articles to get the founder of BBC World News. We were then able to take all of that to Forbes and establish him as a regular contributor, which he remains to this day, pontificating on various business issues. Not necessarily his business or space, but nevertheless, it does the job. Similarly, I mean, this is a sustainability tech, and to be honest, we don't need to over-fixate on this, but the point I'm trying to make is establish the problem that you fix, because actually don't assume that the whole world understands the problem. Funding rounds, it's another reality of how media coverage works, another opportunity for you. People fixate about funding rounds. They also assume that their entire media strategy is done just by getting a TechCrunch. Clearly, it isn't. But it is useful. It's useful as a starting point for what you can then do going forward. Announcing deals, appointments, and other developments. I mean, again, this is perhaps insulting your collective intelligence, but it's about new staff, it's about opening new offices, it's signing new deals. But what I would say to you is, whilst there is a news value in this type of thing, you actually need to go one step further and think about the actual manifestation of these deals. What is the end result? And is the end result potentially newsworthy? And can it be packaged in a way that's newsworthy? So Icelandic company on the left, self-evidently on the right. This is a Finnish company called, or organization called Compensate, which is all about carbon offsetting. You're not familiar with them. So in other words, the deal that they struck with the LSE is the deeper news story. And the thing is, don't get hooked on just appearing in fintech media. Decision makers don't just read fintech media. And in fact, there is a balance between getting in the fintech media to get in the business media and the reverse. Going back to Yoko Ono and Twitter and that sort of thing, it's worth thinking about ways in which you can explain how your technology works by doing something interesting with it. Are there academics you work with? Are there charities you could work with? So for SumUp, which I'm hoping many of you have heard of, card reader from Berlin, we persuaded London Zoo to install it so that you could make donations outside animal cages. We persuaded the Church of England to launch contactless payments, let us pay, as it were, during church services. Also think about data. The British preoccupation with the Baltics and the Nordics means that whereas Italy, France, Spain, certainly Germany, all countries that we love and respect perhaps, but we would never pretend that British consumers or British businesses are going to be following what they have done. However, there is this established narrative that the Nordics, you are 7 months ahead of the rest of the world. So therefore, the trick is work out the data that you're sitting on from your domestic market can actually be packaged and create a news story. So in other words, this is Soundtrack Your Brand, spin-off of Spotify. Their data on how background music had influenced kids in Sweden, in initially an unnamed fast food brand, to consume more burgers, was enough to get a British news story, to create a British news story, which then led to being an international news story, and there you go. So the data that you have from your homeland, assuming you've already launched in your homeland, may actually work in the British media. Content. One of the things you should think about is the creation of content, for want of blog posts that make news, for want of a better expression. So this is for Bocchio, which is a Gothenburg-based accountancy tool. They wanted to reach small businesses, so we looked at the whole phenomenon of businesses having and daughter, long overdue, but and daughter in the title. And again, effectively, this was a blog post which made news, which was relevant to the customer, the end customers. Reactive opportunities. And what I mean by this is you must often hear, read, see news stories where you think to yourself, I can comment on this. I know the answer to this. And the person who is commenting about this is an idiot. Now, what you should do is you should channel that rage and that fury. And you should think to yourself, I will talk to media, because actually I run a company which solves a problem, as we've already identified. Push yourself. Pick up the phone to media and say, look, I'm from this company, we do this, I'm confident enough to talk about this, I can provide some insight to this news story. So don't let these things pass you by. So I mean, this is an example of how Stanford introduced the teaching of ethics within its technology course. What we then did was we presented Hyper Island, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with in Stockholm, which has been doing this for years, to respond. Conferences, the trick is, you're going to a conference, you want visibility of the conference, you want to talk to media at the conference. The trick is, announce something in the news 3 or 4 days before the conference begins, and say that you are announcing this news in advance of your attendance at next week's conference. You then go to the conference organizers and say, look, I've given you this free piece of PR. They're so grateful, they shout about it, and everybody knows who you are before you arrive. In conclusion, in terms of various news angles, one of the things over the past 7 or 8 years, interrupted by the lockdown, has been the fact that pretty much every single international article that's been written about how wonderful Sweden is as a place to launch a startup. I think the Swedes, bless them, assume that this is down to merit in a very Scandinavian way. It is not. We have flown the journalists over, we've put them in a hotel, we have kept them drunk, we've introduced them to perhaps some actor from a depressing TV show that they like, and then they meet with our startup clients and go back and say, my amazing 48 hours in the land of Spotify. Oslo, there's life after fossil fuels. Same logic again. Iceland, there was a banking collapse here. We meet some companies in the banking space to talk about how it's been. What I'm saying to you is, there is brand value in where you are from. Do not pretend to be British when you come to Britain. I once had a German client who did in fact say to me, it is very important that people think that I'm a British person. And I said to him, Hans-Peter, this is not going to work. And the reality is for you, you have this brand, this geographical brand and strength behind you. Lean into it, as the Americans might say. So, in absolute conclusion, before you come to Britain, several things to think about. Number one, your creation story, even if it's a creation myth. Why did your company come into existence? How did it come into existence in a way that is more, I just wanted to make money? Number two, identify who is going to be doing the talking, who your in-house experts are, who can be deployed to talk to media. Think about news stories to which you can respond, which frame your company and the solution to which it provides. And predictions, I capitalize that so I don't forget it. One of the things about the fintech media and the business media is it's forever crying out for people who can say, in 2023, this is what is going to happen. So have your predictions ready. The problem you solve, I'm sort of belaboring this point, but be clear on what it is. Less about potential, more about results. So in other words, every company in the world thinks they're going to be amazing. For you guys, it's all about saying, well, here's the deal we've struck. Here's the proof that we work. Think about partnerships, charities, academics. It boosts credibility. Exclusivity. Don't use PR newswires. This is an American illness which has crossed to this side of the Atlantic, which is where you pay someone $1,000 to then spam 1,000 journalists, and that's your media strategy. No, it isn't. All you are doing is you're making 1,000 journalists hate you, and paying $1,000 for the privilege. Don't do it. Don't email journalists. Ideally, phone them. Treat media with respect, and they will respect you. They are not your enemy, but they're certainly not your friend. And the one thing, top tip, in your homelands, I can't speak for the Baltics, you do this extraordinary thing where journalists will send you the article to check before they publish. It doesn't matter how many times I tell people, for God's sake, don't say that to a British journalist or an American journalist. They will be so offended and assume you are telling them that they are either corruptible or incompetent. Don't do it. I beg you, don't do it. You will, but don't do it. Exploit brand Nordics and Baltics. Media will even take success in your homeland as being relevant to the construction of a story. So my point is, invite them to visit you. There are a whole lot of journalists who are suffering from extreme wanderlust after 2 years. We had, unlike the Swedes, we had a real lockdown here. They want to travel, and I'm pretty certain you will have local governmental organisations back home who surely will cover the cost of an airfare and bring these people to see you. So there we are, covering many things superficially, but I hope something useful. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Benjamin. I'm sure you have lots of questions, both to Mario and Benjamin, that we can take over